$50 billion in federal capital was deployed to rewrite the geography of the modern world. When the global economy ground to a halt, the disruption laid bare a terrifying reality for Western powers. The microscopic architecture that dictates the pace of modern life, from advanced weapon systems to consumer vehicles, was entirely dependent on a fragile, highly concentrated network stretching across the Pacific. The mandate was clear, the capital was authorized, and the mission was to bring the Silicon home. But rewriting decades of entrenched globalization requires more than a stroke of a legislative pen. The post-pandemic push for supply chain sovereignty promised a sweeping industrial renaissance, an era where critical components would be forged safely within domestic borders. Yet, as ground is broken on massive new facilities, a profound disconnect is emerging between sweeping policy ambitions and the brutal economic realities of relocating complex industrial ecosystems. The question now is not just whether this massive realignment will succeed, but whether the very attempt to secure these supply lines is about to trigger a permanent structural increase in the cost of everything. To understand the sheer scale of this pivot, one must look at the specific vulnerabilities exposed over the last few years. Decades of relentless optimization and offshore outsourcing created a highly efficient, deeply integrated global market. This system prioritized cost reduction and just-in-time delivery above all else. It worked flawlessly until it did not. The sudden cascading failures across shipping lanes and international borders exposed an extreme supply chain fragility that governments had long ignored. In response, the United States enacted a monumental piece of industrial policy. The U.S. CHIPS Act was designed as a financial shock and awe campaign, a massive injection of public capital intended to catalyze private investment and rapidly rebuild domestic semiconductor capacity. The legislation was heralded as the beginning of a great manufacturing reshoring, a strategic reversal of the late 20th century exodus of heavy industry and high-tech fabrication. Subsidizing state-of-the-art fabrication plants was framed as absolute national security, a shield against geopolitical shocks. But treating the global semiconductor industry as a simple, relocatable manufacturing process fundamentally misunderstands modern technological production. A fabrication plant is a hyper-sterile, precision-engineered ecosystem requiring specialized chemicals, ultra-pure water, and highly specific machinery. While the initial capital from the U.S. CHIPS Act incentivized rapid groundbreaking, money alone could not instantly recreate an industrial base that Asian markets spent 30 years perfecting. The first structural hurdle was a profound deficit in human capital. Decades of offshoring systematically dismantled the domestic workforce. Constructing clean rooms and installing multi-million-dollar lithography machines requires specialized pipe fitters, electricians, and welders trained for near-zero contamination environments. Beyond construction, operations demand process engineers and materials scientists. Because the United States educational pipeline spent 2 decades optimizing for software engineering, a massive gap in advanced manufacturing remains. Consequently, companies face delayed operational timelines and surging cost estimates. Attempts to bridge this gap by importing specialized technicians from established international hubs have introduced intense cultural and logistical friction. Even if these labor hurdles are overcome, physical reshoring faces another insurmountable barrier: reliance on foreign raw materials. The U.S. CHIPS Act focuses on the final fabrication and packaging of chips, but upstream elements remain stubbornly globalized. If a geopolitical tremor cuts off the supply of a highly specific neon gas, a specialized photoresist chemical, raw silicon, or rare earth minerals, a multi-billion-dollar domestic factory grinds to a halt. This reality exposes a significant gap in the logic of absolute supply chain sovereignty. The attempt to isolate and secure semiconductor manufacturing has not eliminated global interdependence. It has merely shifted the choke points further upstream. The infrastructure required to mine, refine, and process the raw materials for these factories is heavily concentrated in nations that are often at the center of the very geopolitical tensions the reshoring effort was meant to circumvent. As a result, the U.S. CHIPS Act has fundamentally altered global trade alliances. Nations are no longer just trading finished goods. They are aggressively competing to secure exclusive access to critical minerals and specialized manufacturing equipment. This competition is fracturing the previously unified global market into parallel competing supply chains. Allied nations are attempting to coordinate their industrial policies, creating exclusive trade corridors designed to bypass adversarial bottlenecks. This fragmentation of global manufacturing is a stark departure from the era of frictionless free trade. The old model was built entirely on economic efficiency, placing factories wherever labor was cheapest and environmental regulations were most accommodating. The new model, driven by the trauma of supply chain fragility, prioritizes resilience and security over cost. But resilience is inherently expensive. Building redundant supply chains, subsidizing domestic factories, and navigating a severe industrial labor shortage all require massive capital expenditures. These costs do not simply absorb into corporate balance sheets. They are inevitably passed down through the economic system. The drive for manufacturing reshoring is proving to be a fundamentally inflationary force, structurally embedding higher costs into the foundation of the global economy. When the cost of producing the foundational architecture of modern technology increases, the prices of every downstream product must also rise. From smartphones and medical devices to electric vehicles and industrial machinery, the embedded cost of secure, domestically produced silicon will ripple through the consumer market. The era of endlessly decreasing prices for consumer electronics, driven by hyper-efficient offshore manufacturing, appears to be coming to an end. This economic reality forces a difficult reckoning for policymakers and industry leaders. The narrative that the great reshoring would seamlessly bring jobs back while maintaining the cheap consumer prices of the globalization era has largely failed to materialize. Instead, the global economy is entering a period of painful transition, where the strategic necessity of secure supply lines must be weighed against the persistent drag of higher structural inflation. The friction of this transition is visible in the quarterly filings and public statements of the world's largest technology firms. Capital expenditure budgets are ballooning as companies attempt to navigate the new geopolitical mandates while keeping their shareholders satisfied. The subsidized factories are being built, but they are dramatically over budget and chronically behind schedule. The market data reflects a profound uncertainty about the long-term profitability of these newly localized industrial ecosystems. Furthermore, this localized approach to semiconductor capacity threatens to stifle the rapid pace of technological innovation that defined the previous decades. The globalized model allowed for incredibly rapid iteration, with design, fabrication, and testing distributed across specialized hubs around the world. By forcing these processes into geographically constrained silos, the industry risks losing the collaborative efficiency that drove technological advancement forward at such a blistering pace. We are witnessing the messy, expensive reality of unwinding a deeply integrated global machine. The realization is setting in that true sovereignty in the modern technological age is an illusion. No single nation possesses the raw materials, the specialized labor force, the environmental capacity, and the capital required to build a completely self-sufficient semiconductor ecosystem from the ground up. The best that can be achieved is a strategic mitigation of risk, a costly insurance policy against the next global disruption. The U.S. CHIPS Act changed global manufacturing forever, but not by delivering the localized, self-sufficient industrial utopia that was promised. Instead, it catalyzed a high-stakes, incredibly expensive reorganization of global power dynamics. It exposed the absolute limits of capital in the face of deep structural deficits in human expertise and raw materials. As the concrete dries on these massive new factories, the initial question remains. The attempt to secure the microscopic foundation of the modern world has indeed rewritten the map, but the final cost of this artificial resilience will be paid by the global economy for decades to come.